Hi, this is John Rogers with ISA 4220 doing my final project of the vulnerability assessment of Tishauna's servers. Starting off, I want to talk about the operating system issues and vulnerabilities that were found. The Nessus scanner was able to detect some security patches were missing on the CentOS machine. I've listed out those patches here. A few of them are library patches that improve some of the security of applications that depend on those libraries. This affects multiple applications on the server. One application that was running on the operating system is Samba. Samba provides a network resource and has a network presence on the server, although Tishaun did configure his server to not allow Samba on the network. It still posed as a somewhat security issue. Nessus prioritized this as a low, as there were no immediate security vulnerabilities that needed to be taken care of from the lack of patches. However, patches should be updated regularly. For HTTP and HTTPS, I found a few issues. One issue was the key size for the certification was only 1024 bits, and it was an RSA. RSA keys that are 1024 bits in length have been found to be vulnerable to cracking. Attackers can decrypt the information sent from client to server if they're using a certification with a key of that size. Below is a command that you can use for OpenSSL to create a self-signed certification. Although self-sign is not recommended, this was just an example I chose to show how to create a RSA certification that is stronger than 124 bits. The recommended way of actually doing it is paying a cert authority to provide you with an RSA certification and key that is larger than 1024 bits. In going off of the certification, SSL was enabled for HTTPS. However, he was using SSL version 2 and 3, although TLS was enabled and was possible to be used. Some vulnerabilities for these versions have been detected over the years. Recently, in the past few years, SSL version 3 has no longer been recommended as the Poodle vulnerability has surfaced. This vulnerability allows attackers to steal credentials and view information that is being seen between client and server, making SSL version 3 useless. SSL version 2 has a few vulnerabilities. One is the down vulnerability that allows attackers to steal the private key from a session. I've wrote here how to disable the SSL version 2 and 3 and only allow TLS for an Apache server. You use the options with the minus sign in front of it of the SSL v2 and SSL v3 in the HTTP configuration file. Finally, another vulnerability was the trace vulnerability. The trace method was enabled. Trace is not a vulnerability of itself, but it is used in some attacks for cross-site scripting. OWASP has recommended disabling this method because it can be used to steal session information from a cookie that a current user is using. This method of attack requires that the trace be enabled on the server. To protect clients and client accounts, it's recommended to disable it. On an Apache server, add the line trace enable off to the main configuration file will disable the trace method. For SMTP, one thing I noticed was that authentication was not enabled. By default, Postfix uses only the trusted network, which is the local network, to allow for relaying. However, I feel as though this is not as strong security as Postfix could offer. I think using SASL for authentication rather than IP addresses is better suited for security. It forces users to log into the SMTP server in order to use the SMTP server for relaying emails. I think the vulnerability comes from if anyone gets on the network, then they automatically have full access to the SMTP server. I think it would be better to restrict access to only users who require access to the SMTP server for relaying emails. Another issue I did find is when you connect to the Postfix server, it displays that this is a Postfix server running the SMTP protocol. I've found that this is an issue because it tells the attacker what application is using what it shows what server is running SMTP. The attacker can then look up vulnerabilities for Postfix and find issues that surround only for Postfix. Disabling the message might not stop the attacker from finding out what server or service is running the SMTP server, but it will make it more difficult than just plainly telling the attacker that, hey, this is a Postfix server. So to disable this, go to the master configuration file in the etc folder for Postfix and set the variable my name, our mail name, as listed here, equals whatever value you want, and this will be the welcome message that gets displayed every time a user logs in. IMAP, our email protocol for retrieving email, I would like to mention he had Start TLS enabled. This was a good practice to force encryption when clients are receiving emails. I tried to log in using plain text authentication. The server wouldn't allow me unless I used the Start TLS command first. However, even though TLS and SSL was enabled, SSL version 2 and 3 were also enabled. As mentioned before, both of these versions have vulnerabilities that make them not recommended for any modern day use, especially over the internet. One that, of course, Poodle again. Here on the second line, you can see the SSL underscore protocols is the line you would need to add to your etc dovecot 10-SSL config file that will force the dovecot server to use TLS. By disabling SSL version 2 and 3, dovecot will have no other versions of SSL but TLS to use. Another issue, sort of like the SMTP server, was that dovecot displayed a message that showed that this was a dovecot server. As mentioned before, this gives attackers a clear indication that this is a dovecot server that they're communicating with. It's more information in the attacker's hands that they can use, or could potentially use at least, to find vulnerabilities on a dovecot server and attempt to exploit vulnerabilities. Even without the version of dovecot, they can still attempt some vulnerabilities for known or recent dovecot vulnerabilities and target our server. This is a little bit of security for obscurity, which is sort of a gray area in from what I understand. But I feel as though we shouldn't be telling everyone in the world what software we're running. Clients don't need to know that this is a DevCot server. They only need to know it's an IMAP server. POP3, because POP3 runs on a DevCot, does run on DevCot just like IMAP. They share some of the same issues and the same protection. He does have Start TLS running for POP3, so you cannot log in unless you do the Start TLS and start running over an encrypted channel. So that means that authentication is encrypted and that client information is protected using encryption. However, just like the IMAP server, he allows version 2 and 3 of the SSL protocol. And again, the same solution is to disable them by editing the etc dovecot 10-SSL configuration file. Another issue that I left off the IMAP because I wanted to discuss it here was the certification is only 1024 bits long, or is using a key that is 1024 bits long for our certification for SSL and TLS. As the same issue arises just like the HTTPS server, a key size of that same length using RSA as the algorithm has been shown to be crackable and defeated by attackers. It's recommended to use a 248-bit key to produce a certification that is stronger. Again, I've wrote out a command here of using OpenSSL to create a self-signed certification. However, it is recommended again to use an authorized cert authority, so you are able to prove the authenticity of the certification. DNS. One issue was only detected from DNS was cache snooping. This vulnerability allows attackers to detect when a website has been visited recently by someone on the network. This can be useful information to an attacker. They can use it in spoofing, or they can use it in phishing attempts. You can find out what bank, what websites organization goes to. This can prove to be a little bit too much information to share. It's done through testing how fast the DNS server does a recursive query. If the recursive query comes back faster than a normal query, you can determine that it's been cached by the DNS. To do this, we can disable DNS recursive through the properties section of the DNS server in Windows Server. Go through the server management console and go into the properties section of that server, and you can detect and you can disable recursion, and this will disable or help prevent cache snooping. Moving on to Active Directory, I won't talk too much here about Active Directory. Active Directory is not just one part, it's many parts, and I will be talking about LDAP here in a minute. But one issue I did find was that Kerberos had an information disclosure vulnerability that Nessus detected, and it could find the time and realm from the Kerberos server. Nessus gave this a low vulnerability and didn't flag it as very high. I tried to find information on a solution for this, and neither Nessus nor the web provided any clear solution on how to fix this vulnerability. This will probably be something that the vendor will have to fix using a patch. I recommend that checking back ever so often for patches for Active Directory, and hopefully the vendor will catch this soon and fix it. One issue I did find is that it was using Kerberos, and our Active Directory, I should say, was using SSL version 3, and again, SSL version 3 is vulnerable to the poodle attack. This can be disabled through the registry. Um, each server, each version of Windows operating system is a little bit different. LDAP, one of the issues was that LDAP was using SSL, which is good, but it was using the CR4 cipher. This cipher has been shown to occasionally use a weak key when creating its encrypted data. This weak key can easily be broken by attackers if it's found. I think when I read it, it was 1 out of 16 million times that C4R or CR4 will use a weak key. So it's not very likely, but however, there are better ciphers available, so there's really no use to using C4R. Another issue was the cipher block chaining. I won't talk too much about this, but it provides some issues similar to the Poodle attack where or I should say it actually provides attackers a way to decrypt part of the encrypted traffic by stealing the key during the session. And again, we have SSL version 3 running on LDAP. Secure Shell. Secure Shell, like LDAP mentioned before, it's using the RC4 cipher. This is, again, should be disabled in favor of other ciphers. This can be done through the etc ssh underscore config file where it has ciphers. You merely just have to remove it from the cipher list. Another cipher issue was the MAC, which is the message authentication code, is using an MD5 hash. MD5 hashing, although there haven't been any real-world examples or major examples, at least, of this being an issue, and I couldn't find much material on proving this to be an issue, Nessus still flags it as a low vulnerability, and there is, I should say, a push to use SHA-256 as a stronger cipher for hashing. Another issue was the SSH server supports a backwards compatibility using the old SSH version protocol 1.99, or just referred to as SSH1. This backwards compatibility allows some clients that don't have the capability of running the newer version of SSH version 2. However, it does create some issues where attackers can defeat the encryption that SSH uses and break and steal a session or a private key, or a shared key, I should say, and perform a man-in-the-middle attack. And again, SSH has the server or the cipher block chaining, which provides some issues where attackers can steal sensitive information during an encrypted session. That is it for me, and thank you very much.